multiple view directions built into it. So it's a custom block object that responds to the display system. So when you change the display system, it automatically has an impact on this multi-view block. And that's how we're getting a simple 2D graphic here and a 3D graphic here. But how exactly does this take place? Well, if you go to your Manage tab and click the Display Manager icon, that will display the Display Manager dialog, and you can see a series of folders listed over here. Now, the Configurations folder, if you expand it out, lists all of the items that we've already seen back in the drawing on the pop-up menu at the bottom. So when we went from high to medium to low, we were actually changing display configurations. What I want to show you is exactly what the settings for the display configurations are. So if you select medium detail, and then over here on the right, click the Configuration tab, what you're going to see is several view directions are listed, and then over here, there's items next to each of those view directions. So if you choose a top view direction, like a plan, it's going to display a display representation set called Plan. If you do left, right, front, or back, you're getting one called Section Elevation. And anything else is going to give you a 3D model. Now, what these things are in the next folder down. So if I expand this folder a little bit, you'll see here's Model, here's Plan, and here's Section Elevation. Now, just really quickly to show you what's different about each of these, if I highlight Plan and go over here to the Display Representation Control tab, there is a large collection of checkboxes available in this tab. But to understand the difference between, say, Model and Plan, so currently Model is listed as bold right here and selected. Notice that there's a Model checkbox here with all these checkboxes in it for every object type. Doesn't matter whether it's a ceiling grid or a door or a window or an assembly, it's using Model. If I click on Plan here instead, notice that all those checkboxes get cleared, and instead it's using either General or Plan. So in a nutshell, the difference between the two view directions is quite simply the fact that one set of settings gets turned on and another set of settings gets turned off. But all of these settings are part of the same object. So every AEC object has a plan, it has a model, it might have an elevation. And what you're doing is just simply toggling between those different displays. So I'm going to cancel out of here without making any changes. And as you can see that in addition to being able to change different levels of detail, high, medium, and low, or presentation and construction documents, Display System is also exceedingly powerful because it can interactively switch from 2D graphics to 3D graphics to high level of detail to low level of detail and so on. So all of these features are built directly into the AEC objects, and you're getting all of this benefit automatically just simply by drawing with walls, doors, windows, and multi-view blocks. In this movie, I'd like to talk about fixed view display configurations. So in the previous two movies, we talked about various aspects of display configurations. We talked about display configurations in general, and we also talked about view direction dependent display configurations where they respond to the viewing direction. It's also possible to create a display configuration that does not change when you change viewing direction. So it always displays the same type of graphics. To get started, I've already got a project loaded here called Display System. Over here on the Views tab of the Project Navigator, I'm going to double-click the floor plan view to open up that drawing. Now, I'm going to move my navigator out of the way slightly just so I can get to the view cube behind it, and I'm going to click the corner of the view cube and go to a 3D view. And when you do that, you're going to see the drawing immediately pop up into 3D. Now, sometimes that happens a little too quickly to really appreciate what's going on. And it also leads to a big misconception with AutoCAD architecture is that a lot of folks assume that AutoCAD architecture is always in 3D. The reality is AutoCAD architecture is more of a hybrid. Sometimes it's 2D and sometimes it's 3D. And I can show you that in a couple different ways. The first way is I'm going to go back to top view here. And instead of using the view cube, I'm going to hold down my shift key and start to drag my wheel on the mouse to orbit into 3D. Now the trick is I'm not going to let go just yet. So I'm going to start orbiting, and what you'll see here is that the drawing is staying flat. And it's going to stay flat until I let go of my mouse. So as soon as I let go of the wheel mouse, then it understands that I've just changed view direction and it pops up into 3D. Now, this is because I'm currently using medium detail. And from our previous movie, we learned that medium detail is view direction dependent. So in other words, if we change to a 3D view, medium detail says, oh, okay, I'm going to display the 3D graphics instead of the 2D graphics. But there's actually a display configuration on this list that stays two-dimensional all the time, and it's called plan only. So if I choose plan only, notice that even though I am in a 3D vantage point, I am getting two-dimensional flat plan graphics. So if you're not interested in having the model change to a 3D model when you switch views, you don't have to. Using the display system, you can actually configure it so that it always shows you one view or the other. So in this case, it's only showing me the plan-only graphics. Now, how does it do that? Well, here on the Manage tab, let's go to the Display Manager and take a look. It's actually quite simple. If we go to Configurations, expand that, notice Plan Only is currently bold. If you select Plan Only, here on the Configuration tab, there is nothing set for top, bottom, left, right, front, or back. There's only something here in the default category, and that default category is using Plan. So it's saying display plan all the time. Now, in addition to that, down here, it says I'm going to also make sure to override the view direction and force it to top. Now, what that means is they're talking about the multi-view blocks. If you watched the previous movie, you remember we focused in on the toilet element and we talked about its being a multi-view block. What makes a multi-view block work is that inside that object, there are several view blocks, one for plan, one for elevation, one for 3D. And depending on the view direction, it only displays one of those blocks. Here, you're overriding the multi-view block and forcing it to display top all the time. So that's why when I OK out of here and I zoom in, I'm getting a simple 2D graphic. Well, if I went to the Display Manager, went to Configurations, click on Plan Only, and I just simply uncheck this box and click OK, notice that the floor plan would stay flat, but all of the multi-view blocks would pop up into 3D. Because even though the walls and the doors and the windows are saying use the plan configuration, the multi-view blocks didn't get the memo. The multi-view blocks are still doing what they're designed to do. Now, I could make it even a little bit sillier by coming into here and going to Configurations, Plan Only, and instead of leaving it to its own devices, I could still override. But what if we override with the right view or the left view? Well, now we're getting an upright left-hand block all the time instead of the default plan view block, and so on. So that setting at the bottom of the screen is specifically for multi-view blocks. But all of the other AEC objects kind of take care of themselves because they understand that if we're going to turn off the view direction dependent, we want those walls to stay flat all the time. Now, it's actually possible to create your own custom configurations. So I've got plan only. What if I wanted to create one that was model only? Well, all I would have to do is right-click right here, choose New. It's going to create new display configuration. I will rename that and call it model only. And then I'm going to remove the plan override and set that to none. I'm going to leave the default set to model. And I'm going to check the box to override the view direction here, but I'm going to leave it to the viewport view direction. So when I click OK, and then I assign this model only, now I'm getting 3D all the time, whether I'm in a 2D view or whether I'm in a floor plan view. Notice that it's displaying the model version of those multi-view blocks, and notice that it's showing an actual model version of the door object instead of an open door swing, and so on. So a fixed view direction display configuration stays one thing all the time, where a view direction dependent configuration responds to the viewing direction. Both have their uses, both are very powerful, but overall they give us a very different result. In this movie, let's look at how we can customize the display system. Specifically, we're going to create our own custom display configuration. Now, we've talked about in previous movies the built-in display configurations, and if you recall, there was a whole list of them right here. But in this movie, we're going to create our own. Now, I'm in a file called floor plan, and that floor plan is a view file in the project called display system. Now, if you're not sure how to load a project or a project file, we talked about that in some of the previous movies, so you can go back and review there to get yourself into the correct file. So let's start off by talking about what we want our custom display configuration to do. In AutoCAD architecture, we have all the various object types that represent various real-world objects, but sometimes we have object types that are more utility in nature. And one such object type is spaces. So if you look here at the various rooms, you can see I have these room labels in each room. But those room labels are actually attached to something that we currently have turned off. They're attached to space objects that are hidden. So typically, you just label your rooms, but you don't actually draw anything into the space to represent that room. But in AutoCAD architecture, in order for the software to understand that there's a room there has to actually be a room object. And those objects are just called spaces. Now, the way that I've gotten those spaces to not display here is I simply hid the layer. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about layers, and that's certainly an appropriate way to do it. You can just simply hide the layer. If you recall, every time you create an AEC object, it automatically puts itself on the correct layer. So if I open up the drop-down of the layers right here, what you'll see is that there's a layer here called walls A-area-space. That's the spaces layer, and you'll notice here the little icon says that it's frozen in this viewport, which just means that it's hidden, it's turned off. So if I click that little icon, you're going to see all these space objects come back again. Let's close that menu. And there are these really bright primary colors that appear. And so you could see why I probably wanted to have those hidden, because it's a little bit overwhelming to see those space objects with those solid fill hatches. Now, if you were doing a presentation mode and you wanted to color code the spaces, that might be appropriate. But for construction documents, probably not so much. So this is why we might want to control the way those spaces display under different circumstances. Now, what I'm going to do just to make our job a little bit easier is I'm going to switch to low detail. And low detail still displays the spaces, but it uses a crosshatch instead of a solid fill. So the reason I like that better is it just makes it a little bit less overpowering to look at. Ultimately, though, what I want to do is create a display configuration that displays the spaces, but just not in so overpowering a way. And it'll be a really simple example of what we can do in the Display Manager. So let's get to the Display Manager. We'll go here to the Manage tab. And on the Styles and Display tab, we're going to click the Display Manager button. Now, the first step is to create our own configuration. So I'm just going to right-click the Configurations folder and choose New. And it will create New Display Configuration down here. And I'm going to right-click that again and choose Rename. And I'll call this Halftone Spaces. Doesn't really matter what you name it. Now I'm going to select Halftone Spaces over here, and by default, it puts an override for the top view, and it sets it to the plan set, and then any other time it's going to show the 3D model. Now, you can come back later and configure this to make it look a little bit more like medium detail with section and elevation overrides if you want, but for now, I'm going to leave that alone. Let's go down to Sets. The set that I want to load when we're in plan view doesn't exist yet, so I need to create that as well. Now, I don't want to create it completely from scratch because that would be too much work. So what I'm going to do instead is take the plan view that's here that they've assigned already to my halftone spaces. I'm going to right-click it and choose Copy. Then I'm going to right-click again and choose Paste, and it will create Plan 2. Notice that there's no check mark or little green icon next to this box. So what that's basically telling me is this set is currently not in use anywhere. It's just a set, but we haven't applied it. Let's rename it, and I'll call this one Halftone Spaces Plan. Press Enter to accept that name, and it will re-alphabetize itself and go to the top of the list. Now, this dialog can be a little bit overwhelming. I like to think of this as almost like one of those big mixing boards that you see DJs using, and with all those dials and controls, it can be a little intimidating. But the way this works is actually fairly simple. Over here in this column on the left, you have all of the different AEC objects listed. Across the columns at the top, you have all the different ways that those elements can display. Now, sometimes one of those methods of display is not available for a particular object. And in that case, here you see there are no checkboxes. So if it is available, there's a checkbox. If it's checked, it's turned on. And if it's not checked, it's turned off. So what we want to do is ignore everything we see here and focus on the object that we're interested in, which is the space object. So that's going to make this whole thing a lot less intimidating if we just focus in on a single type of element. So there's my space object, and I can display it using this one or this one and so on. So I'm going to scroll across here, and it's currently using plan display. And as I showed you a moment ago, plan display is those big, bright, primary shaded solid fill hatches. So what I want to do is use something that's a little bit less jarring. Now let me open this column at the top here so we can read those a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is uncheck plan, and then here we've got one called plan screened, and I'm going to check that instead. Plan screened is using cross-hatching, and it's set to a dark gray color, so it's a little bit less overpowering than those bright colors. So let's try that and see if that does the trick and gives us the effect we're looking for. So that's all we need to do is uncheck this, check this, and then the last step is to scroll back up here, highlight our halftone spaces, and instead of using plan for top view, we're going to choose the one that we just created, halftone spaces plan. Let's click OK. And then our new display configuration will now be available on the list. You can see it right there, halftone spaces. And when I choose it, you're going to see the spaces are displayed, but now instead of those bright colors, it's using this much less intense halftone hatch pattern. Now, the hatches are a little bit close together, so that's another thing that we could modify, but in order to modify that, we'd have to go in a little bit deeper. But I think at a high level, you start to understand what's possible by setting up our own custom display configuration and kind of working through the display manager and being methodical about what we want to see for each type of object. You could imagine not stopping with just spaces. You could customize the way walls display and customize the way doors display and the way any of the objects display. And then, of course, the advantages of display configurations kick in. With a single click from this menu, you're changing the look of the entire drawing across the board, across all the different objects. So that's the power of customizing the display system. In this movie, I'd like to talk about another aspect of customizing the display system, and we're going to focus specifically on customizing the display of element components. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can do this. So I'm in a file here called Object Display, and this is just a standalone drawing. So this one is not part of our project that we used in the previous movies. So you can just simply open this one from the application menu. So we're going to make three modifications in here. One that's going to be at the drawing default level, one that's going to be at the style level, and one that's going to be at the individual object level. So let's start with the drawing default level. What we mean by that is I'm going to zoom in on this area of the plan right here. And I've got two different kinds of doors displayed in this area. I have this single hinge door here and this double hinge door here. So if you were to click on this object and go to the properties, you would see that the name here is hinge double, and if I click on the other one, it would say hinge single. So there are two different types of doors, and it's pretty obvious because one's a single door and one's a double door. But maybe I want to make a change that ignores the style differences and applies universally to any kind of door. So, for example, we talked about high, medium, and low details in some of the previous movies. So let's go to high detail and notice that nothing changes in the doors whatsoever. The walls change, the hatch gets a little denser, but when you switch between medium and high, no change in the doors. So I'm going to go to high level of detail, and what I want to do is customize the way these doors display. I want to make them a little bit more detailed in high detail. So I go over here to the Properties palette, and I can do this on the Display tab. I've got to have a door selected first, so it doesn't matter which one I select. I can select either door, go to the Properties palette, and click on the Display tab. Now, At the top, under General, is sort of the focus of the edit, like what's it going to be focused on. So the first thing you want to check is that the display representation is what you expect. And notice it says Plan High Detail. So that's good. I'm happy with that, so we can move to the next one. Right above that, it says Display is currently controlled by, and it says Drawing Default. Now there's three options there. Drawing Default, that's the most global. That means all doors, doesn't care what style. Or you could do it just to this style. So not only this double door, but any double door, but none of the single doors. Or you could say this object, only this object, no other double doors. Well, in this example, I'm going to do, and all I want to do here is open up the list of display components right above that. And you can see that some of them are turned on, like panel and frame. Some of them are turned off, like direction and stop. Well, I'm going to turn on the stop, close the menu. It will warn me that this change is about to apply to all doors, regardless of style. Let me move this out of the way so you can see there's no stops currently displayed. And when I click OK, now I get a stop displayed here and here. So that's a really simple example of what a drawing default level change will do. It'll affect all objects of that type. So let's change back to medium detail. And the stops disappear here. So now we have a difference between medium and high detail with respect to our doors. Now I'm going to zoom slightly over here to this portion of the plan. And even though the three walls that come together here look similar to one another, they're actually three different styles. So I've got this construction here, which is CMU and brick. This one here, CMU and brick with some drywall. This one is just CMU and some drywall. So all three are a little bit different. I don't want to see the drywall lines and the stud lines in medium detail. I'm fine with seeing all that detail in high, but in medium detail, it's too much. So I want to turn that off. The trouble I have is if I select either this wall or this wall, because they're two different styles, I don't know which components to turn off. Because if I open up the display component list here, it just lists them as boundary 1, 2, and 3. Now I could take a guess. Let's try boundary 2. And when I click OK here in the warning, it may or may not turn off the right one, like nothing happened. So I guessed wrong. And I could keep guessing, but the trouble is boundary 1 is not the same in each of these styles. Boundary 2 is not the same in each of these styles. So it's really not going to work. You might get it right on one, but it won't work for the others. So let me undo that. So what I'm going to do instead is do a style level modification. So I'll select this wall style right here, go to Properties, make sure the plan representation is active, which it is. Make sure that the display controlled by is what I want. Well, it's not. It's currently set to drawing default. So I'm going to change that to wall style. I want it to affect all instances of the CMU with furring. Now it's going to ask me if it's okay to apply this as an override. So I'll click OK. And now the override is applied. And now what do I want to do to that override? I want to go to the display components. And now it's a little bit easier because notice that the specific boundaries that are part of this wall style are listed and they have names next to them. So now it's real easy for me to know that it's actually boundary 5 and 6 that I want to turn off, the stud and the drywall. And when I click OK here to accept that change, notice that it turns off that extra line work in there and it's a little bit less busy in that small location. Now I still need to do it here, but before I do, let me show you that that change did affect the entire style. Notice that it's turned off here and it's turned off down here. It's not turned off yet for this one. So I'll just deselect anything, select this wall style, go to Properties and just repeat the process. Apply a style override, click OK, go to Properties, and turn off the stud and the drywall. Click OK again. And now I've got it displayed with less detail. If you go back to high detail, those lines still display, but in medium detail, they don't. So what about an object level override? Well, for an object level override, you're being much more specific. It's only affecting the objects that you select and nothing else. It doesn't care about style, doesn't care about global. So if we look at these two windows, they're in toilet rooms. Maybe we have a little bit of a privacy problem there. So it might be nice to take these two windows and make them a little bit smaller. So it's easy enough to do on the Design tab. I'll just change those to a smaller size, maybe a 3x3. Trouble is, when I do that, because their head heights are much higher, those windows actually jump up and they're no longer being cut in this view. The cut plane is still at 3'6". Now you could change the global cut plane, but it might have an adverse effect on other portions of the plan where it starts cutting things too high. So it's not actually the windows that I'm going to apply the next override to. Press Escape to deselect. It's actually the wall that contains those windows that I'm going to override. So all I have to do is select the wall, go over here to Properties, go to the Display tab, and this time I'm going to apply an object level override. This object. Click OK to accept it, go to Properties, and now instead of turning on or off components on the component list, I'm going to come over here to Override Cut Plane and say yes. Once I do that, I can click in here and type a new cut plane height, like maybe 5 feet, and apply that, and you now see that it's cutting through those windows. So using the Display tab on the Properties palette gives us the ability to override the display settings at an object level basis. We can do it either very specifically to an individual selection of objects, or we can be as global as we want, applying to the entire collection of objects, or somewhere in between using the style option. So really the key is to decide how far reaching the edit is that you want to make, and then make sure you're choosing the right level of application: system default, style, or individual object. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the drawing management system in AutoCAD architecture. But just what is drawing management? Well, drawing management is an approach to organizing a collection of project files to make them all behave together as a single project. Now, we should probably get started with talking about what some of the common project setup approaches are for people using AutoCAD in